Okay, so today we're going to answer the question, what is focal length? So this is something that if you are a new photographer, especially if you have been trying to decide what kind of gear to buy or what gear to buy next, you may have heard with your lenses all kinds of things about focal length and trying to figure out what that means. You may have a basic understanding, but you may not really be sure exactly how that might impact your images, right? So today I'm going to break down the basics for you, and then I'm going to talk about the ways that I use different focal lengths and how I choose different focal lengths for the types of photo sessions that I'm doing. Now, I want you to keep in mind that there is no right or wrong when it comes to a focal length. There are so many factors that come into play when you're choosing what lens to use, but you can make an informed choice when you have a full understanding of like what focal length is and what the pros and cons are of different focal lengths. So, to start off with, let's just basically define what is focal length. So, the focal length of a lens is represented in millimeters, and it tells us the angle of view for a lens. So basically what we mean by that is how much of a scene is going to be captured using that lens. For all intents and purposes, kind of what we can say is that the focal length is like how zoomed in your lens will be, or how zoomed in your images are. Like that's the way that I remembered it when I was first starting out. Because when you talk about field of view, you may think like, oh, 16 millimeter, like that's not a very wide field of view compared to a 200 millimeter, right? But that's not exactly what it means. So if you think about 16, think about not being very zoomed in, where like 200, like that's a bigger number, you're zoomed in way more. So that was just kind of a mental trick that helped me understand when I was first trying to grasp like what focal length meant. So I'm going to show you, kind of walk you through this grid. So in the top left corner, you'll see that I am taking a photo with, I'm standing in the same spot for all of these images, but I'm using a different lens. So the top left is 16 millimeters. It's nice and wide. Like you can see the road, you can see the trees all the way off to the side, you can see the field. And if you look way back here, this tiny little thing is like the grain silo. Like I'm like out in the country, and you can see that grain silo. That's important because we're going to look at that here in a minute with some other lenses. So I stayed in the same spot, swapped my lenses, took a photo with a 35 millimeter. So you'll see that I'm zoomed in a little bit more. And when I say zoomed in, I'm actually changing the lenses. I'm not actually using a zoom lens for these. I changed to a 35 millimeter lens. But you'll see that because the 35 millimeter is zooming me in more, I lose some of that, like some of the field of view on the right and on the left. So like the field of view, if you look at the 16 millimeter, it like cuts off on the 35 here and like here, right? But you can see that I'm seeing more of that grain silo, right? So then I swap, take a photo again, this time with the 50 millimeter. You'll see that I'm zoomed in even more for this one. And now like the sun is almost off the edge of my photo, and I'm zoomed in even more towards that grain silo. So then I swapped again, put on the 85 millimeter, standing in the exact same spot, and you'll see that I'm getting closer and closer, zoomed in more and more to that grain silo. Then I swapped, did the 135, same thing, and then here's the 200. So think of it as the 200, high number, zoomed in a lot. 16 millimeter, low number, zoomed out, not zoomed in a lot. So if you're needing or wanting a wider field of view, you can use a wider lens. If you don't need that, or maybe you like the look of a 200 millimeter, there are lots of different things. The 200 millimeter more zoomed in is going to give you more compression. I have another video about that I'll share with you. Those are kind of things that you can consider when you're trying to decide what lens to use. Now, keep in mind that the lens that you're going to choose It also it doesn't just depend on like what lens you have, but it might depend on how much space you have. So maybe I'm shooting a really large group, and it's kind of default for people to say, oh, you're shooting a really large group, like you should use a wide lens. And that's typically true. But if I have a lot of room to back up, there's nothing that says I can't shoot a large group with a 200 millimeter lens. Like it may be more zoomed in, but you can shoot a large group with that lens as long as you have space to back up. And you might actually like the look of that because it does give a little bit more of a compressed look when you shoot with a longer lens. So there is no right or wrong, but as a general rule, if you're not sure how much space you're going to have and you know you're shooting a large group, it'd be good to stick in the 16, 35, 50 millimeter range. So I tend to prefer to utilize a 35 millimeter when I'm shooting things like a bridal party, maybe an extended family session where we have quite a few people. But I also utilize it in my family sessions quite a bit, just because it gives me a different angle. And I tend to swap that out with my 85, just because they give such a different look. Lenses from a 50 millimeter to a 200 millimeter tend to make really good portrait lenses. They don't distort an image very much. They're very flattering in the way that they render your subjects. So those are really good portrait lenses. So let me just show you a couple of examples first. So this image here, this is a wedding party, and this was shot with a 35 millimeter. Now, if I had a lot of room, or if I wanted to, I could completely shoot this with a 135 or a 200. I would just have to be further away. With a larger group, sometimes it's nice to be able to be closer to them so that you can give them instructions, you can talk to them, they can hear you. And so in that case, you can be closer to them and still have a wide field of view if you're using something like a 35. Here are a couple of other images that I have taken with a 35. I tend to really like the 35 for indoor lifestyle images because it has that wide field of view, and oftentimes inside we don't have as much room to spread out. So those are images that I have taken with a 35. And then these are images that I've taken with a 50 millimeter. Like I mentioned before, this is a great portrait lens. It's very standard and typical to the way that your eye naturally sees a subject. So the field of view of a 50 millimeter is almost the same as your natural field of view of your own eyes. So you can think of it that way, like as you look through a lens that's a 50 millimeter, it's going to look very similar to how you actually see the world with your eyes. This is another pair of images that were also taken with a 50. Again, more indoor lifestyle images, really great lens for that. And then here are some images that were taken with an 85. This is probably my personal favorite for portraits. I love the lens compression. I love the way that I get the beautiful look that I want with images. And, but it's also, I don't have to get so far away that my subjects can't hear me. So this is perfect. I really love the 85. It's probably my favorite portrait lens. And then this is a 135. You'll notice in the background of these images that it's a lot more compressed. It's nice and blurred out. Really, really beautiful, sharp subjects that pop off that blurred background. So that's a 135. You do have to be a little bit further away from your subjects for the 135, but it does make really beautiful images. And then these two were taken with a 200. So again, you see even more lens compression. That background is even more blurred out. That happens with a longer focal length lens. There are other ways to get that same look. It's not just the focal length of your lens, but that does play a big factor. But with a 200 millimeter lens, like I had to be pretty far away from my subjects to be able to get these shots. And that can be okay, but if you're working with subjects that you really need to interact with, it can be a little bit tricky. So that's just something to keep in mind. But overall, really you just need to remember that there's not a right or wrong focal length. It's just helpful to understand what they are so that you can make an informed choice when you're trying to decide what lens to use for you and for the environment that you're going to be in. And as you get more and more familiar with the different lenses, you begin to kind of understand and recognize how they make different images look and how each lens makes your images look a little bit different. And then you can decide from there what lens is going to be the best choice for the types of things that you're shooting. So hopefully that helps. Focal length is a really cool thing. Once you understand it, can help you choose the right images to help you get the look that you're after, and can also help you when you're going into a situation where you may or may not know the environment. You can take the best informed guess of what lens you might need. So hopefully that helps. Thanks so much.